As the three prime Western cultural constructs of reality evolve, intertwine, ascend and recede, it needs be repeated that these were the major authoritative and socially pervasive systems. At any time in the history of Western culture, the vast majority of the populace saw reality through a filter largely shaped by the dominant institutions of legitimization. Not exclusively, of course, and not with a homogeneous purity or unreflective passivity. Even within each institution there were critics, camps, factions, schools, pioneers, innovators who helped replenish and redirect the path of the particular institution. Intentionally through struggle, reform and stimulus towards modification and adaptation, or by a more indirect incremental process of integration and transformation of ideas within the given theoretical system. Even when a particular doctrinal approach or school of thought was dominant, currents of potential change and a feeling of inadequacy with some ideational component remained part of the ongoing process of cultural modification. Though even in the context of reform and revision, the prevailing institution itself is not denigrated or threatened with abandonment as such. Trust and faith in the specific system was implicit. Thus, the Reformation was not about repudiating Christianity itself, but an attempt to revise and reformulate the basic tenets. The empiricists did not disdain the enterprise of philosophy and treat the idealists as illegitimate, but just re-envisioned the meaning of experience from a different perspective. Einstein did not seek to invent a new discipline and do away with the foundation put in place by Newton and other pioneers. He just used the tools of mathematics and science to present new data in a novel context of meaning, and in the process, thereby forcing science to adjust to the new parameters. However revolutionary and destructive of older certainties, change from within still provides a tangible degree of continuity. The fundamentals which define the institution still are at least implicitly treated with respect and trust. However, not all movements, thinkers, innovators, visionaries or critics found voice within a prevailing legitimizing institution. Any number of alternative perspectives led to a vast variety of splinter groups, opposing schools of thought, differing perspectives and valuations. Some movements, like the Reformation, evolved into a legitimizing institution of similar importance to the one it grew out of, likewise becoming a socially major legitimizing authority. Other groups and schools have been much smaller and less socially influential, though consistently formulating and presenting alternative visions of reality to those within its sphere of influence. And many alternative interpretations of reality have been virtually private constructions, formulated by individuals and small groups and maintained through writings and private promulgation, often having little effect or influence till a later era, when another generation perceives relevance and resonates with that vision. So we turn now to what can loosely be called a basic and persistent alternative envisioning of reality in Western history. An inner-directed orientation, which has been in existence as long as the civilization in some shape or other, and taken on a number of forms and appearances. But in essence, has retained an identifiable qualitative consistency, though of course expressed in the idioms and terminology of the given time and location. Following the entire evolution of this alternative mode of envisioning is beyond our scope here. We are particularly concerned with the appearance of the most significant elements of this constellation of ideas passing from the 19th and throughout the 20th century. Although a nucleus of earlier themes and forms retained importance, many of the dynamics of this time frame were unique and intimately connected to wider prevailing systems of knowledge and belief. As well, a significant portion of this overall orientation comes from extrapolation of selected elements of the revised and reconfigured ideational systems of 20th-century religion, philosophy and science. However, as authoritative and dominant institutions, the specific threads of knowledge and perspectives noted yet remained minority components within the respective overall ideational systems. We will not identify them as such at this point in the proceedings, though their effects and influence on other tendencies will be apparent directly or indirectly where applicable. It is necessary right now to identify the more unique and discrete characteristics and tendencies of this inner-directed orientation. There are many objectives, ideals, beliefs which may be representative of an inner-directed alternative envisioning of reality. Not exhaustive by any means, but certainly representative and consistent motives include those of spiritual realization, integration of the personality, harmonious balance of life, self-fulfillment, attaining mythic, paranormal, mystic insights and knowledge, fullest self-expression and creativity, conforming to spiritual evolutionary ideals, creating a better world, etc., etc. And some of the forms of expression can be discerned in themes of alienation, utopianism, spiritual longing, authenticity, and so on, becoming more explicit and dominant in the aesthetic and cultural milieu. A renewed glamour and attention was directed to a number of occult themes, imagery, concepts. Eastern spiritual texts were utilized to supply a new kind of authority and legitimacy to emerging interests in spiritual disciplines and practices. The nature and widespread connections of psychological states, processes, functions were extensively explored. The roles of the individual in society, and the effects of a dominant technological society became thematic constants. A more accurate understanding of the forms and functions of non-technological societies emerged, recognizing that non-rational channels and techniques of spiritual representation and connectivity could flourish. A renewed and more objectively disciplined attention to all forms of non-rational experience and claims of knowledge and insight manifested in a number of disciplines. And any number of other unique mixes of inner-directed motivation and forms of representation can be uncovered. It would be very easy to lose focus and dwell upon the extensive abundance of ideational and sociological minutiae, but our intentions are to only sketch some of the more dominant expressions of the inner-directed envisioning of reality considered as a reaction to the traditional majority vision. As mentioned, a variety of mixes and configurations similar to this perspective have appeared throughout history, mostly as a minority alternative way of envisioning reality. Let us begin by looking at a number of broad overviews taken at discrete moments from the latter part of the 19th throughout the entire 20th centuries. Though far from complete in detail, they serve as cross-sections of a particular kind of perspective towards the envisioning of reality. First, an excerpt from H. P. Blavatsky, who synthesized and consolidated much of the material which collectively represented this kind of an early modern comprehensive alternative envisioning of reality. As a founder of the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century, presenting, explicating, defending an inclusive vision of reality diametrically opposite that of the prevailing materialist perspective entailed a certain strident and polemical attitude. In this quote from 1889, we find a speculative picture anticipating a 20th century ideationally reconfigured along particular ideal lines, with her society prominent in articulating that direction. Then the society will live on into and through the 20th century. It will gradually leaven and permeate the great mass of thinking and intelligent people with its large-minded and noble ideas of religion, duty and philanthropy. Slowly but surely it will burst asunder the iron fetters of creeds and dogmas, of social and caste prejudices. It will break down racial and national antipathies and barriers and will open the way to the practical realization of the brotherhood of all men. Through its teachings, through the philosophy which it has rendered accessible and intelligible to the modern mind, the West will learn to understand and appreciate the East in its true value. Further, the development of the psychic powers and faculties will proceed healthily and normally. Mankind will be saved from the terrible dangers, both mental and bodily, which are inevitable when that unfolding takes place, as it threatens to do, in a hotbed of selfishness and all evil passions. Man's mental and psychic growth will proceed in harmony with his moral improvement, while his material surroundings will reflect the peace and fraternal goodwill which will reign in his mind, instead of the discord and strife which is everywhere apparent around us today. But I must tell you that during the last quarter of every 100 years an attempt is made by those masters, of whom I have spoken, to help on the spiritual progress of humanity in a marked and definite way. Towards the close of each century you will invariably find that an outpouring or upheaval of spirituality, or call it mysticism if you prefer, has taken place. Some or more persons have appeared in the world as their agents, and a greater or less amount of occult knowledge and teaching has been given out. We here have a broad outline of some of the main components of the inner-directed alternative orientation. A belief that there is an esoterically recognizable underlying spiritual intelligence guiding in some manner the evolution of mankind and the phenomenal world. That an intrinsic state of full equality is the natural status for all people, and that social, political, racial, ideological barriers are superficial and debilitating, and must be dealt with from an enlightened perspective in the process of establishing a viable and actual brotherhood of man as the operative order of social existence. Man is perceived to have actual or potential access to a range of non-rational mental faculties and powers, which are related to personal and species evolutionary conditions. That there is an esoteric embodiment of psychic and spiritual knowledge represented in the traditions and thought of the East. The belief that there are cyclical macrocosmic and microcosmic process operative in some manner. That the present is in some way or another a time of trouble or crisis, prefatory to the introduction of a more spiritually grounded, harmonious and evolved future. Naturally there are many variations to this kind of inner-directed overview, with specific arrangement of ideational contents and prioritized concerns. Not every alternative orientation attempts to focus in every direction or emphasize the same themes, though there often is a fundamental empathetic congruence between many of the various beliefs, ideals, ideas, values, objectives. And over time, any number of specifically detailed premises can be revised or reconsidered as new knowledge and insight enter the equation. Here is a view from a bit more than a decade later, written in 1901 by Richard M. Buck, in which is an evolutionary process is projected as a passage from simple consciousness to self-consciousness to cosmic consciousness. If we are right in the assumption that human evolution has not ceased, new faculties will from time to time arise in the mind, as in the past, new faculties have arisen. This being granted, let us assume that what is called cosmic consciousness is such a nascent faculty. And, first, it may be noted that the new sense does not appear by chance in this man or that. The subjugation of the old personality along with the birth of the new is, in fact, almost equivalent to the annihilation of the old and the creation of a new self. The duplex personality of men having cosmic consciousness will appear many times as we proceed and will be seen as a constant and prominent phenomenon. The theory of evolution was a relatively new and stimulating ideational theme, especially in late 19th and early 20th century speculation, and it was easily adapted for application to a number of areas not technically covered from the purely scientific perspective. And as such, it became a very common thematic component in future inner-directed speculation. Buck's classifications in essence describe an impending though gradual transition to a mystical mode of consciousness as the consensual norm, prefigured in history by the great spiritual personages. Some of the traits of that condition are a subjective sense of profundity, moral elevation, intellectual illumination, recognition of a transcendent spiritual quality underlying the self and the universe, the emergence of a distinctive type of magnetic charismatic personality. These identifiable characteristics are inclusively linked not just for descriptive purposes, but to envision a specific kind of idealized and value-laden future status for humanity. As in many varieties of inner-directed and other forms of speculation, the distinction between myth and hypothesis is often blurred. Speculative inference based exclusively on actual knowledge very rarely remains unaffected by the values and feelings which shape the lines of interpretation and presentation. A distinguished Xing tendency in much inner-directed speculation is the idealized envisioning of the world of the future as a distinctly spiritual milieu, more harmoniously integrated and structured than the world at the present moment, whatever year that may be. There may be any number of anticipated stages, crises or obstacles, but the end result is virtually inevitable, ultimately a matter of the dynamics of evolutionary and cosmic processes stimulating human and personal adaptive and creative reaction and response. In 1913, 12 years after Buck's writing, we find this representative theosophical position from Leadbeater, a leading figure in that organization. It may be of interest to see what light is thrown upon the problem of the future by the higher extensions of human consciousness. We find that from this point of view the future divides itself into three parts: the immediate, the remote, and the ultimate, and, oddly enough, it is of that which is furthest from us what we are able to speak with the greatest certainty, because the plan of evolution is visible to the highest sight, and its goal is clear. Nothing can interfere with the attainment of that goal, but the stages that lead up to it may largely be modified by the free will of the individuals concerned, and can, therefore, be foreseen only in their general outline. The end, so far as this cycle is concerned, is the accomplishment of the perfection of man. Each individual is to become something much more than we now mean by a great and good man, for he is to be perfect in intellect and capacity as well as spirituality. All the intellect of the greatest philosophers are men of science, and far more, all the devotion and spirituality of the greatest of saints, and far more, these are to be the possessions of every unit of humanity before our cycle ends. One of the variants of inner-directed envisioning is the stature of credibility about the source of the speculation itself. Very often the individuals and groups promulgating a specific orientation will base their reasoning and logic on a variety of sources and disciplines, including contemporary and traditional religious, philosophical, scientific, historical, academic, creative, and other bodies of knowledge and information. As well, with some inner-directed individuals, institutions and schools of thought, appeal to a more authoritative source often supplies much of the primary data, which augments and legitimizes the secondary ideational materials. This usually pertains to some form of extrasensory acquisition of information, whether through the personal experience of the individual, the dependence on the enunciation of the results of such experience from other known contemporaries, or the teachings and traditions of others who have allegedly had such direct cognition in the past or who are unknown personally. In the above quote, we see the personal claims of the use of the higher extensions of human consciousness, used to authoritatively legitimate the particular outlook by implying that there is more than a hypothetical and speculative basis underlying the picture. The plan of evolution visible to highest sight is fairly representative of that school of thought and of the general inner-directed perspective, postulating a radically transformed spiritually enhanced future. However, the appeal to an extrasensory authoritative legitimizing mechanism is a variable which often can be discerned in some form or other, directly or indirectly, though is not a necessary or defining characteristic of inner-directed envisioning. At the start of the next decade, P.D. Ouspensky speculated about the same evolutionary theme. These words are from Tertium Organum, in 1920. What is important is the possibility and the imminence of the new consciousness. All this announces to us the nearness of the new humanity. The future belongs not to man, but to Superman, who is already born, and lives among us. A higher race is rapidly emerging among humanity, and it is emerging by reason of its quite remarkable understanding of the world and life. It will be truly a higher race, and there will be no possibility of any falsification, any substitution, or any usurpation at all. It will be impossible for anything to be bought or appropriated to oneself by deceit or might. Not only will this race be, but it already is. The men approaching the transition into a new race begin already to know one another, already are established passwords and countersigns. And perhaps those social and political questions so sharply put forward in our time may be solved on quite another plane and by quite a different method than we think, may be solved by the entrance into the arena of a new race consciousness of itself which will judge the old races. Once more we see the same inner-directed belief in a progressive evolutionary movement to a distinct spiritually grounded condition. As well, the identification of an elite mysterious vanguard with passwords and countersigns reiterates a theme of a hierarchical, hidden, source of directive and organizational power. The remarkable understanding of the world and life bespeaks of a different perspective, a superior way of envisioning reality based upon a new consciousness, more befitting the enlightened and wise Superman of the future than mankind of the present. The inner-directed envisioning of reality often, though not always, is based upon this kind of belief in a spiritual evolutionary process. And with the notion of superior evolved supermen, adepts, masters, messengers, incorporated into the ideational structure as ideals, examples, emissaries, functional entities, a number of logical inference can easily be made about how and where they may appear and be acknowledged. According to the precise sets of doctrines, theories, and beliefs, they have been variously located and conceptualized. They have been thought of as a great white brotherhood, functioning from the Himalayas. As distinct personalities reincarnating as significant spiritual and secular figures, constructively shaping history. As extraterrestrials guiding the evolutionary process. As individuals with unprecedented and remarkable skills or talents or moral character. As traditionally visualized religious figures. And a number of other blends and variations, usually along similar lines. In fact, there quite often is a merging of mythical themes and images, historical information, religious aspiration, hypothetical speculation. The variables fall into place as the unique dynamics of each set of ideas and beliefs coalesce at the particular time and place. For instance, J.D. Beresford, writing in 1930 about looking towards 1975, had this quasi-messianic expectation for the near future, anticipating the unfolding of a dramatic spiritual transformation. I have found my mind constantly engaged with the thought of what to me is the most profoundly moving possibility in the future of mankind, the return of the great soul for whom the world has found so many names. But what, to me, seems the most notable characteristic of religious feeling at the present time is just this urgent need and preparedness for another inspired messenger to give an impulse to the thought of the world. We do not look for confirmation, but for a new gospel that will at once embrace and transcend all the diverse faiths of humanity, and this implies that it will contain a new element about which in our present ignorance it would be vain to speculate. I would keep an open mind, as free as possible from any prejudice, with regard to the person, status, or even some of the particulars, the gospel of the great soul who will, I firmly believe, come to preach and inaugurate the new dispensation before the close of the present century. And I believe that if we are to recognize him when he comes, it will be by self-discipline, meditation and culture of the divine essence in ourselves, not by any attempt to foresee the character of the messenger in the manner of high appearance. This kind of generic inner-directed expectation may appear relatively similar in form to traditional religious myths and beliefs. However, it differs in being nonpartisan, synthetic, open-ended, non-specific or dogmatic. Mankind is in present ignorance, and needs guidance and direction, a spiritual impulse to the thought of the world. And expressive of the basic inner-directed orientation, it is the individual who must bear responsibility for proper receptivity. It is through personal self-discipline, meditation and culture of the divine essence in ourselves, that an empathetic and fertile state can be achieved. The specifics about historical conditions and circumstances are simply representative of the tendency to view the present as a crisis condition for mankind and project a time in the future where revolutionary spiritual reorientation and redirection manifests. Midway through the next decade, in 1946, Aldous Huxley presented another interdirected perspective. His linkage of thematically congruent spiritual literary materials in The Perennial Philosophy represents another envisioning of reality prioritizing spiritual values and non-rational modes of experience and knowledge. In his definition of this, Philosophia Perennis, he sketches a broad outline which in essentials reiterates many of the basic interdirected premises. It is the metaphysics that recognizes a divine reality subsistent to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to, or even identical with, divine reality, the ethics that place man's final ground of all being, the thing as immemorial and universal. Rudiments of the perennial philosophy may be found among the traditionary lore of primitive peoples in every region of the world, and in its fully developed forms it has a place in every one of the higher religions. The metaphysical, psychological and ethical dimensions of this interdirected orientation have been dealt with and prioritized in diverse ways according to the overall system of beliefs, values, objectives. However, if reduced to essentials, a universal thread can be discerned, despite how possible difficulties of cultural expression and secondary embellishment may distract and confuse. This cross-cultural and trans-historical, fundamental unity, or at least, compatibility, of core interdirected ideas and values is one of the more prominent themes found amongst the different groups, schools of thought and organizations. Different critiques, evaluations, objectives determines what ideas may be emphasized and prioritized or deliberately kept obscure or obtuse. The social and historical context will usually be a major determining factor in that regard. By the end of the next decade, the post-war ideational climate began to reflect a distinctive kind of undercurrent of change. A growing, though still minority dissension towards many entrenched premises, principles, social and interpersonal scenarios, belief systems, political tendencies etc. of mainstream, established Western culture provided fertile ground, reviving and re-energizing the effort to seek alternative options. For instance, in 1959, Norman O. Brown, writing from a psychoanalytical perspective, saw common themes from a number of areas. Psychoanalysis, mysticism, poetry, the philosophy of organism, for Bach and Marx, this is a miscellaneous assemblage, but as Heraclitus said, the unseen harmony is stronger than the seen. Common to all of them is a mode of consciousness that can be called, although the term causes fresh difficulties, the dialectical imagination. By dialectical I mean an activity of consciousness struggling to circumvent the limitations imposed by the formal logical law of contradiction. As we shall see, a number of these separate disciplines and traditions represent particular approaches, and supply their own content and perspective. Not all of these or the many other sources of ideational content necessarily interlock to present a wholly consistent or fully integrated single envisioned picture of reality. However, there indeed are many common and mutually supportive foundational premises, perceptions, themes, values, which are congruent and consistent in their unseen harmony. Isolating any mix of perspectives will provide a picture with emphasis along certain lines. Focus on discerning a dialectical imagination reveals one logically identifiable interdirected direction. When other ideational elements are thrown into the equation, a variety of differently constructed and construed pictures will emerge. This particular emphasis is on reconceiving and re-evaluating the process of experience itself, the activity of consciousness struggling to circumvent the limitations imposed by the formal logical law of contradiction. As such, the materials of the various disciplines will be considered in that light. Other interdirected outlooks may go in other directions, focused and prioritized on different objectives and ideational materials. In the 1960s there was a unique new impetus given with this recognition of a certain empathetic connection between the objectives and materials of many of the interdirected orientations. Enthusiastically endorsed primarily by a segment of the population under 30 years of age, this particular phenomenon attained its own sociological status, and was characterized by a number of identifiable traits. Factors such as opposition to the Vietnam War, prioritization of self-expression and personal exploration, experimentation in the approach and conduct of social relationships, the major role of mass media as a means of representing and disseminating information and ideas, the emergence of the genre of rock music as a channel of embodiment of ideas, the valuation of and access to mind-expanding techniques and stimuli, etc., collectively helped shape a particular mood and tone. Extensive social analysis is not our concern, though. We simply are interested in the ideas, beliefs, ideals, perceptions which appeared at this time, representing a distinctive valuation of an alternative mode of envisioning reality than that operative for the larger dominant population at large. Roschek, writing in 1969, observes the situation as it then appeared. It strikes me as obvious and beyond dispute that the interests of our college-age and adolescent young in the psychology of alienation, Oriental mysticism, psychedelic drugs, and communitarian experiments comprise a cultural constellation that radically diverges from values and assumptions that have been in the mainstream of our society at least since the scientific revolution of the 17th century. At this point, the counterculture I speak of embraces only a strict minority of the young and a handful of their adult mentors. And that perspective, also made in the same year, he reiterated it in these words. The search for ecstasy, the need for something above everyday experience, seems rooted in man. Civilization has not killed the primitive need, it continues today in the use of LSD and other drugs, in the revolt of the flower people, away from accepted social standards and their search for a new outlet and a new vision. In that social context, the mix of inner-directed ideas and ideals translated into a variety of hybrid expressions and speculative conclusions. An emphasis was placed more on immediate experiential experimentation and criteria of verification than on primarily theoretical belief or longer-term incremental disciplined processes. Often selected portions of various inner-directed ideational structures were revised, reconsidered, contemporized and reincorporated in support of the new emerging mindset. The countercultural representations certainly were not the only inner-directed formulations by the end of the 1960s, as many of the other earlier schools of thought, societies, lines of speculative attention persisted and evolved. But because of the nature of the demographic entrenchment and mass media treatment, the inner-directed alternative envisioning of reality since the 1960s acquired a different status and tonality. Less confined to the treatments of isolated groups with minimal mainstream legitimacy, or the purview of a minority of idiosyncratic innovative intellectuals, teachers and thinkers, much of the substance of inner-directed thinking filtered into the vocabulary of common parlance. Even if evaluated contemptuously or dismissed on any number of grounds. And even though still a basically minor ideational stream compared to the socially dominant legitimated picture of the nature of reality, the influence yet was felt more pervasively from the 1960s and beyond. The popularization and mass media dissemination, even when superficial or misleading, of much of the terminology, conceptual and speculative inclinations, ideals and motivational intentions, added new elements to the larger collective public consciousness. And what of the substance of this 1960s flavored inner-directed worldview? In essence, it was ideationally consistent with many of the premises and values of preceding decades. However, the major shift in focus was on the prioritizing of first-hand relatively immediate experience as the effective means of verification and confirmation. In the 1970s, many of the thoughts and values of the previous decade passed through a process of adaptation and refinement. Much of what had been superficially treated or sensationalistically represented either faded from attention as times changed, or received more serious and less public focus by those committed and interested. Many ideas, beliefs, ideals became more entrenched as components of the inner-directed alternative orientation, giving new substance and stimulus to many of the thematic threads already operative during the century. For example, here is a quote from Dane Rudhyar characterizing a confluence of ideas, ideals and influences as they appeared at the three-quarter mark of the 20th century. The particularly appropriate encompassing term of 1960s, counterculture, retained its own sociological legitimacy still. The field of action of the present aspect of counterculture is increasingly defined by psychic research of all kinds, and by the modernizing of yoga techniques and spiritual mental disciplines, most of the time under the direction of individuals claiming a more or less direct contact with, or inspiration from, occult centers in Asia or the Near East. The fascination with magic and witchcraft, good, bad, or indifferent as the practices may be, is certainly spreading, and concern for a more humanistic and countercultural astrology or cosmopsychology, providing psychological if not spiritual guidance. The number of persons using or claiming clairvoyance and contact with inner guides, space people or discarnate healers is steadily increasing. What is more, the people interested in all these manifestations of a countercultural trend, which most definitely challenges the validity of our Euro-American cultural mainstream and all that it takes for granted, are increasingly recruited from the above 30 and above 40 generations, and from the university and scientific field. Counterculture is not dead. It has never been so important and significant. All the nearly unquestioned premises on which our Christian and rationalistic Euro-American tradition has been based are becoming increasingly empty of vital contents. What is interesting to note in this statement is the tendency to feel the traditional legitimating institutions, on which our Christian and rationalistic Euro-American tradition has been based, were becoming less adequately congruent for this counterculture minority social segment. The envisioning of reality primarily through the prism of faith and reason had become incrementally disconnected with other experiential values, ideas and beliefs, increasingly empty of vital contents. Our enunciation of the major ideational components characterizing this kind of alternative mode of envisioning reality shall deal with particulars including and other than those mentioned above. A similar attitude, also from the same time frame, is expressed in these words from R. A. Smith's Frontiers of Consciousness. The space ventures, the drug culture, Zen and yogic exercises, Sufism, experiments in cinema, television and other forms of programming via informational media will have a profound influence on man's psychological development. Celestial storms of karmic illusions. With glacial, floating, aurora borealis lights of red and yellow whites, rainbow liquid cascades of exquisite sheerness, will become more common. But during the same period research into alpha waves of the human brain, galactic plasma rhythms, of the Earth's pulsing heliosphere, ionosphere, and magnetosphere, the DNA RNA helices, and into kibbutzim and other forms of communal living may bring us out of the karma and into cosmic awareness. And in the early 1970s, Alan Watts had this projected anticipation of how the inner-directed impulses of the 1960s would play themselves out in the year 1990. In his look into the future, Watts idealized a number of changes, collectively forming an ecstatic way of life. This hypothetical reoriented envisioning of reality in the future was perceived to emerge as the outcome of those changes initiated earlier, but brought to the forefront in the 1960s. It wasn't until 30 years ago, in the 1960s, that there began to be any widespread realization that ecstasy is a legitimate human need. Ecstasy, in the form of mystical experience, had also been the objective of a growing minority that since the beginning of the century, had been fascinated with yoga, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen, Vedanta, and other forms of Oriental meditation, and these people were always rather serious and demure. But in the 60s, everything blew up. Something almost like a mutation broke out among people from 15 to 25, to the utter consternation of the adult world. From San Francisco to Kathmandu. At the peak of our technological affluence, these young people renounced the cherished values of Western civilization, the values of property and status. Richness of experience, they maintained, was far more important. The components in his vision included a consensual world recognition of an impending ecological crisis, leading to a redistribution of military spending prioritized towards environmental rebalance. The legalization of consciousness-expanding drugs. New varieties of therapeutic encounter groups and different kinds of enhanced sensitivity training, as part of the mainstream lifestyle. Cinematographers and dramatists with attuned sensitivity creating new forms of film and theater, tied in with advances in psychotherapy, forming a foundation of an art science of ecstasy called ecstatics. Vibration training, which through electronic and sensorial stimulation evoked desired neuromuscular and psychological sensations. An international cooperative venture in creating and distributing the components for multimedia, multi-sensory immersive environments, which would, when used, initiate a transformation of consciousness. A tolerant, informal casual lifestyle and outlook on life for the majority of the populace. A workforce no longer regulated by 9 to 5 hours, for the most part able to work staggered hours totaling about 10 per week and spared from drudgery by impending innovations in technology. Sensually prioritized intentions behind the creative and ritualistic conduct of household activities and functions, from sexual relations to preparation of meals, from bathing to recreational pursuits. An extension of the human lifespan up to 150 years of age. Tapping the power of gravitation for improved transportation techniques and the solution to the problem of smog. Creative and thoughtful use of leisure time for rewarding hobbies and indulgences. More of an awareness of proper and healthy nutrition. A playful and innocent enjoyment of the little things of everyday life. Less restriction from psychological hang-ups and selfish preoccupations. A prevailing recognition of a spiritual unity underlying all facets of existence. Of course, this kind of speculation is based upon projection of ideals, values, beliefs, aspirations, knowledge of the present in a certain direction. And the objective may be the postulation of a hypothetical logical conclusion to those presumptions and inferences. Watts reveals his motivation in these words. This way of interpreting reality does not contradict the scientific way. On the contrary, it restores a whole dimension of value to life which your passion for objectivity neglected, and by comparison, your exclusively scientific universe seems a dislocated, rattling, and senseless mechanism. In the largest sense, it left out man himself. We have put him back. Not as a definable object but as the basic and supreme mystery. These types of embellished future-looking of course express general idealized attitudes in the terminology of the times and with reference to the hoped-for direction which the framework of contemporary knowledge will eventually lead to. And as such it represents a particular orientation of beliefs, expectations, values, which collectively embody an envisioned reality structured along other than traditional lines. Implied are a number of the ideational elements which combined, produce that kind of encompassing envisioning. Those include such things as faith in the benign transformational, informational and functional beneficence of scientific knowledge and technology, the efficacy of Eastern spiritual practice and knowledge, the insights, delights, cathartic energies deliverable through artistic forms and conveyable through mass media, potential realignment of interpersonal and broader social forms of relationship, and a purveying sense of a quasi-limitless horizon of consciousness. And if we move forward to the next decade, the 1980s, we find the inner-directed systems of the past still at times serving as viable models for revised and more contemporary materials of envisioning. For instance, near the start of the decade in 1981 Ken Wilber places the basic elements of this type of knowledge, the perennial philosophy, within the framework known as the Great Chain of Being, in other configurations. According to the perennial philosophy, the path of transcendence follows what is called the Great Chain of Being, which is said to be a universal sequence of hierarchic levels of increasing consciousness. The Great Chain of Being moves, to use Western terms, from matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. Thus history, from this viewpoint, is basically the unfolding of those successively higher-order structures, starting with the lowest matter and body, and ending with the highest spirit and ultimate wholeness. Thus evolution, history, that path of and to transcendence begins so to speak at the bottom, at the lowest rung of the great chain, and works itself up from there. And, in a very special sense, the same is true of the human arc of evolution history. As well as the reworking within explicitly familiar structures, other more idiosyncratic presentations were formed. With the passage of time, some of the terms, contextual references, forms of hypotheses change to suit the prevailing state of knowledge and reflect the specific ideas, ideals, aspirations, beliefs of those envisioning the nature of reality. And in certain kinds of constructions, attempts are made to phrase the issues in the language and imagery most in vogue at the time amongst particular speculative circles and in the interested public at large. In these words of Terence McKenna from 1989, we find this kind of an extended speculative foray, expressing an attempt to map out both metaphorically and historically the logical culmination of a fully inner-directed state of being. There is no contradiction between ecological balance and space migration, between hyper-technology and radical ecology. The real historical entity that is becoming immanent is the human soul. The monkey body has served to carry us to this moment of release, and it will always serve as a focus of self-image, but we are coming more and more to exist in a world made by the human imagination. It means nothing less than the transformation of our species. Very shortly an acceleration of this phenomenon will take place in the form of space exploration and space colonies. The coral reef-like animal called man that has extruded technology over the surface of the Earth will be freed at last from the constraints of anything but the imagination and the limitations of materials. This is what we have always striven for. We will make our world, all our worlds, and the world we came from will be maintained as a garden. The transition from Earth to space will be a staggeringly tight genetic filter. The technological conquest of space will set the stage, then, for the interiorization of that metaphor, the conquest of inner space and the collapse of the state vectors associated with this technology deployed in Newtonian space. A technology that would interiorize the body and exteriorize the soul will follow on the heels of space colonization. The merits and credibility of this mythology, eschatology, are not our concern. What is instructive are the underlying premises and presumptions, the ideals and aspirations. Though phrased in graphic and suggestive language, we see an idiosyncratic variation of the basic inner-directed orientation. There is the absolute dependence on the enlightened use of technology. Belief that an evolutionary process is unfolding which will extend from the physical to the spiritual. That normal consciousness is limited and conditioned, but grounded in a transcendent reality. That the imagination is a creative and vital force. That the metaphor of outer space exploration is a legitimate and useful model for articulating the continuing investigation of the mysteries of inner space. That a new world order, in its physical, social and spiritual forms, will emerge when the old order is discarded or transformed. In this particular verbal construction, we see or infer reference to pure factual science, to scientific fact-based speculation, to science fiction and mythological motifs and themes, to familiar religious and philosophical notions, to the dynamics of consciousness and non-rational modes of experience, to radical changes in biological, historical and social conditions. Generally speaking, One example of a specific configuration and synthesis of the ideational materials pertaining to the representation of reality most confluent with the personal presiding beliefs, ideals, values, feelings, interpretations of knowledge and experience, which may or may not resonate and captivate on a wider consensual basis. And here is a perspective from the mid-1990s, from Barbara J. Marcianiak, reiterating similar themes from a similar orientation. Every crisis we're facing today, whether personal or collective, is a crisis I consciousness. What's occurring is that the cosmic calendar is going to do a big seasonal shift very soon, and when it does there's going to be chaos. We are looking at the dismantling of civilization as we know it. The important thing to realize is that it's not an end, it's a beginning. It's a cycle that happens over and over again. You are moving head-on towards a collision. You could say the greatest collision you will ever have is meeting your own power and learning how to accept true responsibility for it. Your task is to become more multidimensional. Many of you may be seeing visions or noticing the thin veil separating the dream world from the waking world. You are not mistaken. You have been so involved in your technological developments that you do not see what they represent. All your miraculous technology is but a mirror of your own inner psychic capabilities. It is a symbol in your outside world reflecting the growth of your spiritual, psychic byways. It is imperative now for those of you who are capable of holding the energy in your body to open up these doorways. It is also time for you to realize you are not working alone. In order to understand who you are and the greatness of your being, you must wake up to other forces of intelligence that exist beside you. These cosmic technicians look over you the way laboratory technicians watch the animals they supervise. You must become aware of these entities, and begin to claim your power with them. You are approaching a shift in the cosmic season, and the chaos around you see around you is the restructuring that will take you to a new place. Throughout the chaos, you must learn to integrate the new cosmic energy and live it. It's this energy that gets you in touch with more than your senses. It's going to get you in touch with a whole new social order and vision. Know that you are significant and that life has a purpose. Once more we are presented with an impending crisis, as a stimulus to transformational attitudes and behavior. The future of contemporary civilization is perceived to be heading towards a chaotic dissolution, already hinted at and intuited, and driven by the forces of cosmic necessity. But the potencies and powers of the individual are qualitatively distinct, and pertain to psychic and spiritual conditions, and a reality greater than that perceived through normal consciousness. As well, this greater reality includes entities, energies, powers superior to those of the familiar world. And a change in orientation and consciousness will serve to allow a harmonious transition and adjustment to the subsequent realigned and more spiritually integrated order. These few inner-directed perspectives are representative of some of the many positions adopted approaching and throughout the 20th century. Each is built on a number of premises and inferences, and particular treatments of knowledge, opinion, ideals and values. Much of the ideational material derives from specific cultural and informational sources before becoming integrated as part of the new or revised mix. We can now try to identify and differentiate the major ideational components which have contributed to an inner-directed envisioning of reality evolving through the latter part of the 19th and throughout the 20th centuries. These ideational strands are not exhaustive, and may easily be reconfigured along other analytical lines, but presented as such, do indicate distinctive content. These inner-directed ideational components can be distinguished in the following forms. The broadened range of knowledge deriving from the study of primitive cultures. The influence of Eastern cultures, ideas, techniques, teachers on Western thought. A reactive sense of cynicism towards technocracy and its depersonalizing and threatening effects, countered by positive valuation of more organic and holistic attitudes. The influence of ideas pertaining to the subconscious and a deeper sense of personality and human potential. The consideration of the phenomena of parapsychology and a wide range of associated forms of esotericism. The influence of a renewed examination of the substance of mysticism. And the objective of attaining relatively immediate transformation of consciousness through external stimulus. And an enhanced, harmoniously balanced and optimum life. Some of the data opened up to study, investigation, synthesis within larger frameworks of ideas was new, the result of discovery and scholarship. And much emerging speculation was simply a renewed and expanded way of interpreting and understanding the data, applied to phenomena and experience previously represented less objectively or taken as less legitimate within the mainstream religious, philosophical and scientific perspectives. And though distinguishable as discrete influences, any encompassing ideational structure is always an evolving synthesis. So while new or revised data is thrown into the mix of ideas, the familiar envisioning apparatus is also at work synthesizing, integrating, reconfiguring, re-evaluating, rejecting portions of what is newly presented. Thus the inner-directed influence has filtered through into the religious, philosophical and scientific ideational systems in particular ways and in varying degrees. Thus we can find inner-directed envisioning both as components in evolving familiar legitimizing systems as well as independently expressed within self-subsistent and more alternative frameworks of knowledge. Throughout the centuries, Western civilization has seen a plethora of cults, associations, groups, societies, brotherhoods, underground movements, individuals and so on, who were dedicated to exploration, consolidation, promulgation of visions of reality other than those legitimized within the socially prevailing nexus of cultural institutions. These have appeared in a variety of configurations, from the formal, communal and intimate to the more casual, sociable or study-oriented. Even the loose association of common and shared interests labeled as a New Age movement, throughout the last part of the 20th century can be classified as an inner-directed orientation to envisioning reality. To list all examples and differentiate between their unique prioritizations and conclusions here would take us on an excursion away from the main topic, but the point is in the empathy of ideals and attitude rather than the explicit formalities. The minutiae of each perspective do not at this moment concern us. As well, we are not trying to determine factual validity or content of truth within any system or perspective. To do so would require a very different approach to the data. We simply are describing and enunciating some of the distinguishing traits and characteristics which seem to indicate an inner direction of value and interpretation of experience. And how those particular ways of envisioning reality have either been neglected, devalued, imperfectly and falsely represented, or not factored into the mainstream of traditional Western ideational representation. As well, we shall try to see how the three legitimizing institutions, religion, philosophy and science, in their collective presence as the traditions of faith and reason, have dealt with the data pertaining to those inner-directed orientations. For our purposes, firstly we need to clarify what the ideational core of an inner-directed orientation may consist of. As discussed earlier, we have said that human subjective awareness can very loosely be said to consist of three stages on an experiential scale. These are presented as categorical divisions based on a mix of the known facts, logical hypotheses and inferences, claims of the assertions of individuals over the historical record. We do not imply that what can hypothetically be stated and reported as experience necessarily has equal quotient of objectively measurable facticity. By definition, some modes of experience are rare and laden with many layers of obscuring and confusing detail. However, to the mere observer, the, as given, cumulative record seems to suggest the distinctive divisions of the subconscious, conscious and supraconscious modes of experience. Of course, the domain of consciousness is by far the most apparent and dominant, the direct link to the objective pole of experience, and the means by which all forms of experience are made intelligible and definable. However, the human mind is active on more levels, as experience is more than the portion of the spectrum pertaining to consciousness. And although just that assumption has not, and in some circles still, is not accepted as a given, at the very least, the hypothesis does seem to deserve support as an accurate way of categorization. If by simply looking at the record, the at least hypothesized presence of a level of experience usually called the unconscious, has been incorporated into many frameworks of knowledge over the 20th century. At times called the irrational, we prefer to use the term subconscious, simply to establish the framework for a scale of consciousness. Sub, thus simply infers a state which is characteristically below consciousness in terms of cognitive capacity. Not that it is any less real, powerful, determinative, effectively active as part of the subjective content of experience. The subconscious just makes itself felt and known in forms other than the rationally comprehensible. Manifestation appears more via the apparatus of the imaginative function than through the operations of the intellect, and thus has always remained enigmatic when attempted cultural classification has been applied. And though considered as mysterious and somewhat unfathomable, the subconscious retains legitimacy as at least a logical hypothesis, drawn from facts of experience. However, postulation of a hypothetical scale beyond the conscious has been much more of a difficult proposition to expound upon, to articulate and to verify. For definition, we again return to the cognitive criterion. While the nature of subconscious experience in itself is purported to be below the threshold of conscious assimilation and intellectual representation, the supraconscious mode of experience is alleged to contain a cognitive dimension. Thus, above, consciousness in terms of both being more than the ordinary range of knowledge and feelings, yet also capable of some form of personal translation and memory to or through the intellectual and imaginative tools of consciousness. And of course, the most recognizable kind of experience is that pertaining to so-called normal consciousness. We have earlier discussed the dynamics of symbolization, the modes of intellectual and imaginative representation, the Western cultural channels which provide meaning for experience through traditions of faith and reason. In context of subconscious and supraconscious modes of experience, normal consciousness is the main network processor, the converter of diverse energies, mostly occupied within the dynamics of self-world functionality. Nonetheless, consciousness deals with the perpetual input of the subconscious and maintains the capacity for transcending the conditioned and retaining cognizance of new modes of experience. So, we now have touched briefly on the characteristics of the different types of experience, recognizing of course that even hypothetical divisions cannot be presented as absolutely self-contained. There are points where certain classifications are based on subjective opinion, dependent on certain criteria distinguishing one or another factors as being more or less representative of a particular classification. Let us briefly look at the infiltration of some influences of mostly the 20th century which have become in some way part of the nexus of ideas and influences surrounding some of the inner-directed alternative envisioned reality structures. These are certainly not exhaustive by any means, but seem to serve adequately in differentiating between specific types of data, tendencies and directions. For the sake of convenience, we can place these inner-directed influences in two categories. The first can be seen as the influence of outside culture and a reaction to modern technological tendencies. That particularly refers to the confrontation with knowledge and beliefs pertaining to primitive and Oriental cultures as well as attempts to apply the knowledge and products of technology for life-enhancing purposes. The second is more an influence of the data pertaining to types of experience other than legitimized through faith and reason. And these would include the influence of ideas about the subconscious, parapsychological experience, mystical states of consciousness. And a further category is revealed more by an attitude towards the boundaries of experience. That is a socially discernible tendency towards desire for easy and instant opportunity to enact change of consciousness, mostly via external stimuli. First, we begin by looking at a source of late 19th through 20th century widening of perspectives which can be generalized as the influx of outside ideas and knowledge. Through more extensive travel, exploration, means of communication and investigation,